Imagine a wave 25 feet tall, moving faster than a car speeds through city traffic, made of something sweet enough to pour on your pancakes. That is not a movie pitch. It happened for real on a January afternoon in Boston, and by the time it stopped, 21 people were dead. The strangest part is not the wave itself. It is what that substance did to human bodies once it slowed down, how a company cut corners that got people killed, and how one bizarre disaster quietly rewrote construction laws across an entire country. Scientists at Harvard would later run fluid dynamic simulations just to explain why this stuff was so much deadlier than plain water. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how a giant tank of a kitchen staple became one of the strangest mass casualty events in American history. Picture Boston's North End on January 15th, 1919. It was unusually warm, 50 degrees after a brutal cold snap. Towering over the waterfront stood a steel tank 50 feet high and 90 feet across, built by the Purity Distilling Company. Inside sat 2.3 million gallons of molasses, over 12,000 tons, waiting to be turned into industrial alcohol for munitions and rum. At 12:30, workers heard a low rumbling groan, like a train passing underground. Then rivets began popping out of the steel one by one, sounding almost like gunfire. Within seconds, the entire tank ripped apart. A wall of thick brown liquid exploded outward, not gently oozing but surging 25 feet high, moving in an estimated 35 miles per hour. It smashed buildings, lifted a train off its tracks, and swallowed everything in its path before anyone could even react. Here is the part almost nobody expects. Molasses should be slow. You have watched it crawl off a spoon. So how did it kill 21 people and injure 150 more in seconds? The answer is physics working against the victims twice. First, the initial wave hit with the force of a flash flood, strong enough to snap the steel legs off an elevated railway. Second, as the molasses spread and cooled in the January air, it thickened dramatically, becoming almost like wet concrete. People who survived the initial impact found themselves trapped, unable to pull free their arms or legs as the syrup set around them. Horses died, standing up, glued to the pavement. Rescuers described wading through waist-deep syrup for days, and some victims were not recovered until weeks later, buried under a substance that had essentially solidified around them. Why did a 50-foot steel tank just explode on an ordinary Wednesday? The company blamed anarchist bombers, insisting sabotage was to blame since anarchist attacks were common paranoia during that era. But when survivors sued, investigators uncovered something far more damning. The tank had been built in weeks, never properly tested, and was already known to leak so badly that children in the neighborhood used to scrape sweet drips off its sides with sticks. Engineers testified the steel was too thin for its size, missing enough rivets to be structurally sound, and never checked by a qualified engineer or architect. The temperature swing was the final trigger. A cold snap followed by warmth caused fermentation gases inside to expand rapidly. Adding pressure, the flawed tank could never have survived. It was not sabotage. It was corporate corner cutting hiding in plain sight for years. The cleanup alone tells you how much molasses we're talking about. It took over 300 people, including cadets from a nearby ship, weeks to clear the streets using salt water from fireboats and just plain sand. The harbor itself turned brown and stayed that color until summer. Cleanup crews tracked sticky residue across the entire city, onto trolleys, into telephones, through people's homes miles from the disaster site. For decades afterward, longtime residents insisted that on especially hot summer days, you could still catch a faint sweet smell drifting from the old waterfront, molasses supposedly baked into the wood and brick of the neighborhood. Historians can't confirm it scientifically, but the story became local legend, passed down for generations. It is a strange kind of haunting, not by ghosts, but by a smell, a neighborhood permanently seasoned by one afternoon of disaster nobody who lived there could forget. What happened next changed how buildings get approved in America. Furious survivors filed one of the very first class action lawsuits against a major corporation in Massachusetts history. The case dragged on for 6 years, produced over 20,000 pages of testimony, and forced engineers to publicly explain, for the first time in court, how basic calculations could have predicted the collapse. In 1925, a court-appointed auditor ruled against the company, which paid out roughly $628,000 in damages, a massive sum at the time. More importantly, Massachusetts and eventually other states began requiring architects and engineers to stamp calculations on major construction projects, with independent oversight before approval. That single soggy catastrophe helped establish safety standards still baked into building codes today. Every time a skyscraper or stadium gets built, there's a distant echo of what collapsed in Boston that January. Nearly a century later, scientists could not resist one more question. In 2016, researchers at Harvard modeled the disaster using fluid dynamics equations, treating molasses as what physicists call a non-Newtonian fluid, one whose thickness changes dramatically with temperature and stress. Their simulations proved the syrup would have moved almost like water in the first horrifying seconds, explaining the wave's shocking speed, before rapidly thickening as it cooled, which explains why victims got trapped rather than simply swept along and washed clear. It turned a folk disaster story passed around Boston for generations into a genuine physics lesson, one now taught in some engineering classrooms to illustrate how deadly ordinary materials can become under the wrong conditions. What looked like a bizarre historical accident turned out to be a case study in how liquids actually behave, hiding in a story most people assume is exaggerated folklore. So the real twist is not that a flood of molasses killed people. It is that the substance's slowness was the danger, not its speed. The wave arrived fast enough to kill, and then hardened fast enough to trap survivors before help could reach them. Beyond the tragedy, the disaster quietly reshaped construction law, forcing engineers everywhere to prove their math before a single beam goes up, a legacy still protecting people in buildings you walk into today. 21 people died so that skyscrapers, stadiums, and bridges would be checked by someone other than the company profiting from cutting corners. Somewhere in Boston's North End, under ordinary streets and quiet parks. The ground itself is technically a memorial to the deadliest dessert topping in American history. Subscribe for more stories like this.